opposed? The ayes have it. Report
No closed session.
on the closed session, Jim.
There was no closed session this morning.
Public comments on matters not on the agenda. I have no request for anybody to talk. Approval of the August the 18th, 2016 minutes. I need a motion for that and for the September the 15th, if there's no objection to either one of them.
I'll move for approval of the minutes as presented.
I'm going to have to abstain, I wasn't here.
I'll second it. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. Review of the monthly revenues and expenses. Our banker is here.
Good morning, Mr. President and members of the board. This report is for August 2016. For the month of August, the agency opened with a cash position of approximately $4.6 million. There were no appreciable revenues for the month. Most of the agency's expenditures for the month of August were associated with land acquisition costs for the Southport project and some minor costs for the other North area project closeout. The agency ended expenditures for the month at a total of $742,000, and the agency's ending position was $3.8 million, $3.9 million. On the revenue side, we're expecting a true-up payment from DWR either by the end of this week or probably sometime next week for $5.3 million. We have some good news. We haven't throughput all the way yet, but we're getting signaling from DWR that the real estate approval process is actually moving forward better than we anticipated it would. So we're hoping, we're still modeling those reimbursements aggressively, but we expect to start seeing some of that money start to come back to the agency before the end of the year too as well at this time. With that, that ends the August report for 2016.
Do you have a rough figure on what we're going to get on the next amount of money for the relocation and, with
Real estate?
DWR, for the
I would actually ask
demolition
Paul.
and everything?
I would ask Paul if he could, if he knows off the top of the head. If he doesn't, I'll take a stab at it.
So I think we're in a position that we can ask for reimbursement for up to $10 million before the end of the calendar year.
Good.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. That'll make our banker happy. Okay. Item number, consent agenda. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah,
on the
Mr.
consent?
President, on item 7, I'd like to have a better presentation from staff on some of the particulars of the request.
Is this on right here? Good morning, Mr. President, members of the board. I'm going to go ahead and present to you, hopefully, a brief overview of the elderberry shrub relocation and mitigation credits. We've currently got a staff paper on, hopefully provide you some insight on what those costs are, what it is we are getting for those costs, and hopefully answer any questions you have after the fact. Now, one thing I did want to point out is that while we're talking about elderberry shrubs, with this particular presentation, we do have some other biological resources that are impacted with here. So we'll have mitigation costs coming down the line for giant garter snake, which is kind of integrated into this, as well as Swainson hog foraging habitat, ag land, and trees. So this is kind of the first bite at the apple, if you will, of mitigation costs we're going to have to entail. So hopefully this provides you some insight, but you should see some stuff in the coming months from staff regarding those other biological resources being impacted. So we're off. First, wanted to give some background regarding the documents, environmental documents that showed that describe the impacts to the elderberry shrubs, as well as how we're going ahead and mitigating for them. So the EIR is really project-specific as far as what the impacts were. So a lot of that was detailed in there, the amount of shrubs that were going to be impacted based on the project improvements at the time. As we continue to go ahead and refine the design and actually have the construction documents, we'll be able to refine that. And as I'll talk about it later on, we were able to narrow down the survey and really give you the actual impacts and the numbers from that. The biological opinion also took a project-specific as well as an overall look at the entire West Sacramento GRR area and the impacts to the elderberries there. And kind of our guideline book, also put together by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that reference right there, the conservation guidelines. This is really the instruction manuals on exactly how we're going to be doing this relocation work, the ratios we're having to meet based on the size of these shrubs, locations, things of that nature. I'll get into that a little bit more details, but these are really the 3 documents that cover the elderberry shrubs, and everything's really dictated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're kind of the overseers of the elderberry shrubs and what we need to do to mitigate for the impacts. So based on the final design being where it's at, we were able to perform a elderberry shrub survey. GEI, our environmental consultant, performed that in August 2016. Based on their survey, looking at the project area and immediately around it, there were a total of 91 elderberry shrubs identified. Now out of those 91, 45 are actually within project impact areas, so the setback levee D grade, offset areas, things of that nature. Based on coordinating with the reclamation district and our designer, we were able to save 15 of those that were in the direct impacts, so not having to relocate those, saving some costs there. Unfortunately, there are 30 elderberries that are going to be impacted and we need to relocate. So that's really what these costs are associated with, the impacts of those 30 shrubs, and unfortunately some of them are very large. So that winds up affecting the mitigation ratios. A table that I'll show you shows kind of what that impact actually is.
Will we be able to relocate those at the elderberry site on the port?
From my understanding, it doesn't sound like we're able to. I don't know if there's not enough room for it or whatever it may be, but based on kind of where we're at with the project and what the mitigation requirements are before we go to construction, and because time of the essence in this particular item, because there's a very narrow window when elderberry shrubs can be done, essentially November 1st to the second week in February, which is one of the reasons we prepared the staff paper. We've got to move on this hopefully sooner rather than later. I don't believe there's any identified areas that we can go ahead and relocate this, so this really is our only option. Now, there are 2 conservation bakes that we got quotes from, and you'll see those later on, but that's kind of, because of how specific and narrow the focus is on this, we really got not too many options at this point. Now, all the other elderberry shrubs are either going to be completely avoided or protected in place. I just wanted to note that as well. So we'll have construction fencing up, things like that, to protect some other shrubs, but the 30 definitely do have to go. Here's a kind of a diagram or overall aerial of where the shrubs are, the little red dots, all the way from the north to the south end of the project, as well as a few in the Borrow 1 area, kind of show you they're all over the place. They do tend to be in clusters. As you can see, a lot of it is in the Bees Lake area, and actually the ones we were able to avoid are just north of Bees Lake, those 15 that I mentioned before. But everywhere else you kind of see within that bluish purple shading area, which is where the project impacts are the locations where we got to go ahead and do the relocates. So this table right here kind of demonstrates the information that we got from the surveys. So what they do is they went out there, they got the location of the elderberry shrubs, measured the size of the different limbs, as you can see anywhere between 1 and 3 inches, 3 and 5 inches, and everything above 5 inches. In addition to that, they also looked at the if it was in riparian or non-riparian habitat. So that second column goes ahead and kind of gives you that information. There's also beetle exit holes being present. All this affects the ratios, and as I have in those parentheses, those are the ratios you have to compensate for. The number of stems, as you can see right there, was also categorized. So what this ultimately winds up doing is we take those numbers of the stems, multiply them by those mitigation ratios. The elderberry seedling planting is essentially cuttings or seedlings that'll be planted as mitigation for these. And then there's also associated native plantings, so plants, shrubs, trees that they'll plant with the actual seedlings. So it's not just a bush sitting out there all by itself. There's other plantings associated with it as well. So based on all this information, all these ratios that we have up here, it came up to a total of 378.4 credits. That credit number is what we typically multiply the credit amount by, and that's how we came up with the amounts that we have shown later on. So there's a credit as well as an actual physical relocation cost associated with the elderberry stuff. So that's what the next slide will cover. Cost of field work to physically relocate the shrub, that's your excavation, transport, replanting. So the cost that we have in our staff report, that's separated out, and that's one of the $74,000 or $63,000, depending on who's you look at. That's what that cost, and that's what that cost entails. The big cost is in the purchase of the conservation credits. Now that amount includes everything I have listed here. So essentially, the use of 15.62 acres based on the guidelines that were given and the impacts we're doing, we're essentially purchasing the use of that acreage with this credit. Along with the use of that acreage to go ahead and do this work, we're also paying for the maintenance of the transplanted elderberry shrubs, the planting of the elderberry seedlings, some of those ratios you saw in the previous table, that's what we're having to plant as well. The plantings of associated native species, those are those grasses, shrubs, trees that I also talked about earlier. We're also paying for the long-term protection, monitoring, reporting, and if needed, the replacement plantings. So the credits entail the cost associated with all those. And by having it go to a conservation bank as opposed to having us, as soon as this cost is paid, we're relieved of all our obligations in regard to these elderberry shrubs. So pay for it, and we get to forget about it after that. And I think that brings us to my spreadsheet. This is just a repeat of what you guys have in the staff paper in regards to the costs associated with it. You'll see the conservation credit being the biggest dollar item, and that entails all that the planting work that's associated with it, the physical transportation of it all, the bulb transplant. That's to say the $79,000 or the $63,000 number. We did also, as part of getting this quote, get some GGS conservation credits. So that's based on the acreage that we're impacting of upland habitat, and then a mitigation ratio that's in the environmental documents as well. But that's in there also for your review. So that hopefully gives you guys a little more insight into the costs associated with it, what those costs are actually buying us. If you guys have any specific questions or anything else, I can try to answer them.
You happy?
Well, I don't know if I would say I'm happy. 15, how many acres was it that need to be set aside?
So if I think 15.6.
And that's enough land for these 30 transplanted shrubs, plus all of these additional seedlings that they're going to be planting?
The guidelines in that one document by Fish and Wildlife Service requires, I believe, 1,800 square feet per seedling. Yeah, there's 1,800 square foot for each elderberry transplant. So the transplants area is based on that, the seedlings and everything else. So all that encompasses that.
The rationale of those ratios, you know, and they seem to go up as a plant is bigger and those type of things. Where did that all come from? Because if you take the plant and you transplant it into an area that is protected, it seems to me you've kind of mitigated for your impact, but they got these additional ratios coming in. If something happens to that plant, I could see the need to replant like it says there, but we're quadrupling or even beyond that what is in place now.
And everything we're doing is based on the Fish and Wildlife Service's guidelines. So this document, like I said, is kind of the instructions for how we're doing this. So yeah, associated with doing these impacts to these elderberries, we have to do seedlings as well as the native plantings. And the ratios, like you said, are based on, you know, other presence of exit holes. If there are, you got to pay more. If it's in riparian, there's a higher mitigation ratio. But you know, yeah, it is in addition to just transplanting
And
the
if
actual elderberries.
we follow these guidelines, we use one of these two companies that provide the habitat, and we pay the costs. Are we relieved of our responsibilities at that point?
Yes. Then it becomes the property and the responsibility of the conservation banks, whichever one we wind up selecting. So.
Okay.
We keep paying money, though, to them.
Well, as we move forward, we're going to go ahead and negotiate, of course, the final cost number with whoever we wind up selecting, and also how we're going to go ahead and pay that. Because the work is probably going to be done over 2.5, 3 months, we'll see if we can go ahead and work out some kind of payment plan per se to happen over that time frame. That way, it's not just one big hit all at one time. It is a big chunk of change to go ahead and pay all at once. So that'll be part of the negotiations. But once we go ahead and pay that amount, we are done. So no future payments after essentially March of next year.
Okay.
Anything else?
Uh,
Any other questions?
No, I mean, I could go on here, but it's, you know, it's just kind of a sign of the times. It's how, you know, good intentions seem to get overridden by, you know, the entire process and, you know, overkill or whatever you want to call it, but it's what's been established. You know, I don't think we are the organization to try to change it at this point. I mean, we gotta solve it. The giant garter snake ratios of 3 to 1, I think, are excessive too, based on the habitat that we have there and the condition of the land. Once it's completed, is basically going to be very close to the condition that it's at now. But that's the guidelines that are presented to us, and you know, we need to follow them.
Yeah, and for GGS, like I said, we're still looking at the actual overall impacts that we have. So there's an opportunity there to kind of shrink that footprint in the area of Bees Lake, you know, especially on the water side of that. We're not putting, you know, an impermeable road or anything else like that. We're
Right.
just doing some grading. So I think we can lessen the impacts there. And then in the vicinity of Glide Lake and Lake Shangri-La over in Barrow 1, we're still analyzing the impacts there. So anywhere we have an opportunity to, and it's going to be restored, i.e. temporary impacts, we're looking at that as best we can.
Okay.
But when it comes to permanent impacts, and like I said, you know, if there's a roadway going there, or if there's going to be a levee there, there's not much we can do at that point. But like the staff is doing our best to try to minimize the impacts wherever we can,
Okay.
save some of that.
Thank you.
In your travels, when we buy something, land for impact, can we use that land later on? Not for this time. Can we use that land later on, or portion of it, to transplant stuff on our own into that mitigation? Like we have, up the river, we have quite a few acres, which we have with RD 1000. But there's still a lot of land in there that I don't think we're using, especially since they did away with the duck thing. But, and the same way on the west side of the Deepwater Channel, we have a mitigation site over there. And I don't think we're using all of that. Is there any reason that we can't, on some type of a device, or that we can get into use that?
Well, I'm by no means an expert when it comes to that, but I know that in order to go ahead and be able to say that a piece of land is usable for something like that, there's quite a bit of documentation and coordination that has to go on with the resource agency responsible. Like, for instance, for the elderberry stuff, in order for the banks to even be able to qualify for it, there's a whole vetting process that has to happen. There's agreements that have to go forth and things of that nature. So there's costs associated with kind of developing that, and like I said, overall, there's going to be long-term expenses that are associated with that. So reports, monitoring, studies, and things of that nature that go on.
Well, we've already gone through that.
Well, there's, for this particular species, it really depends on it's species driven as well. So like I said, if you have a piece of land out there, you'd have to go ahead and prove to the Wildlife Service or whoever the agency is that this particular land is able to go ahead and receive whatever transplants we have.
Right.
So there's, like I said, there's possibility to do it, but it really is, it can be very difficult. And I could see for, like, you know, a major project, a very large one where we're talking about doing that, there might be a cost benefit to doing that. But like I said, consultant costs that are associated with that, the actual land costs, there's a lot that can go into it.
Thank you very much. Bill, you got anything?
No, this is just frustrating. But I know we have to do it, so there's not much you can do. And now, if the elderberry beetle comes off the endangered list, then what happens?
So we missed the window on that.
We missed the window on that, okay.
Yeah, like I said, so essentially, let's say 5 years down the line, it
Right.
comes off. We've already paid the money, the conservation bank's already set up, there's no refund. So, all right, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
Beetle has a very strong lobby.
There's nothing left on the consent agenda.
Then, based on his report, I would move for approval of the consent agenda as presented.
Second?
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Regular agenda, no items. WSAFCA project updates.
Morning, President Denton and members of the board. I'll just go over a few of the items that are contained in the progress report for highlights. As Mark pointed out, the state has processed about $5.3 million in true-up from previous quarters. It's administrative action right now. We expect to receive those funds literally any day now. For the Southport project, I think since the last time we met, staff received the executed stream bed alteration agreement. It's a permit from California Fish and Wildlife. So that permit has been finalized, and we're still in the final stages of closing out the Section 404 permit with the Army Corps of Engineers. We expect to be able to close that one out in November and get that permit squared away. For real estate services, as Paul had mentioned, we have quite a few real estate packages at various stages in the pipeline through DWR. General Services, Department of General Services has actually approved some of the appraisals of a couple of very large acquisitions. So we are optimistic now that the Flood Projects Office will be able to process those approvals for reimbursement. We're looking at near term about $3 million in reimbursement, and as Paul had mentioned, hopefully by the end of the calendar year, maybe as much as $10 million in reimbursement coming from the state. For the levee project bid, the previous bid opening was set for next Thursday, October 27th. Based on the number of comments and response to comments that we received from the bidders, we're extending that deadline to November 3rd, 1 week. So we'll be opening bids now on Thursday, November 3rd. That still should be enough time to present an item for the board's consideration at the regular November board meeting. Cultural resource inventory. Our consultant completed all of the subsurface survey work they were doing with the exception of segment A, which has to be those subsurface trenches and augers have to be performed literally in the toe of the levee. So we were requested by the Army Corps of Engineers to wait until we're under the 408 permission in order to be able to do that. And there are a couple of augers or trenches in just a couple locations in segment G that are also right adjacent to the levee. So it's maybe 2 or 3 days worth of work that we'll get to probably in November when we expect to have the 408 permit. In the meantime, excuse me, our consultant is performing or putting together the cultural inventory report that they'll be submitting to the Corps. We anticipate that being submitted for Corps review the first week in November. And that'll be a partial inventory report, about 90–95% complete for the Corps' review and approval. And then once we complete the remaining inventory work in November, we'll submit an addendum for Corps' consideration once that work's done. Oh, and by the way, after all of that work that we've done, there have been no significant cultural material at least up to this point, discovered as part of that process. There is one site near the northern area of the project, around the 3000 South River Road area. It's not anticipated that that's going to be eligible for listing with either the state or National Register of Historic Places. Nevertheless, there is material there that indicates that there may have been some site in earlier times. So But that's about it in all of the inventory work that we've done thus far. That's really all that's been found. So it's encouraging, but I don't want to establish a false sense of security because we haven't gotten to the major earth-moving work yet, and that's really where, if anything's going to be discovered,
Where
that's
was this
when it would happen.
located?
I'm sorry?
Where was this located?
In the general vicinity of 3000 South River Road.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm almost done.
Pardon?
I said I'm almost done. On to the general reevaluation report. I think the board is aware that the House passed their version of WRDA back, I guess it was back in September. And all indications are that we'll have a final WRDA to be executed in November. So we're monitoring that weekly. We're talking with our federal lobbyists weekly. Things are looking good. Staff from both parties are meeting in committee as we speak to develop that final WRDA. So
After the election?
either before or right after, yeah.
Yeah, lame duck.
And then two other things. So yesterday was the 2016 preseason flood coordination meeting for the Sacramento region. So staff, myself and others attended. And I guess the takeaway from that is there's really not a whole lot to take away in terms of what we can expect for weather this year. Greater than 50% chance that it's going to be a dry winter, but you just never know. So we'll keep doing what we do and keep preparing like we prepare, which leads me into the next item, which is California Flood Preparedness Week. It starts next week, and the city and WSAFCA are partnering with the Washington Unified School District again out at Riverbank Elementary School. So next Wednesday, October 26th, 10 a.m. out at Riverbank Elementary School, we have a press event scheduled along with speakers from Congresswoman Matsui's office. We would love, and we're planning for the Congresswoman to attend and have some remarks, but you may have heard that she was in an automobile accident a couple weeks back and is still convalescing, so we don't expect her to show, but her local staff will be there to say a few words, as well as representatives from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Department of Water Resources. And our Mayor Pro Tem, Bev Sandin, will also be there to say some remarks. The kids will be playing the Plan, Protect computer game, the Flood Challenge, as well as doing some other activities on site. So you're all invited, 10 a.m. Next Wednesday, Riverbank Elementary School. Hope to see you there. And that concludes my report.
It wouldn't hurt if we would send a get well card to Matsui.
And we did. The city, I know, sent flowers, and I personally contacted her staff to extend our collective well wishes and a speedy recovery. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sorry, one last item. So there's also a fall newsletter going out that should be in the mail within the next week or so. So look for that coming to your homes. I'll also have hard copies here at City Hall at the various counters to distribute, and I can bring a couple hard copies to the next board meeting as well.
You okay?
Okay.
Anybody have anything to say? Be quiet then. Meeting's over.